So one of the major reasons why Russia starts to fall apart in World War I is because of the Russian Revolution. So let's think about the background contributing towards this overthrow of government in Russia by first discussing, of course, the figurehead of the revolution, Vladimir Lenin. So in 1898, you have the formation of the Social Democratic Workers' Party. It's going to be founded in the city of Minsk with Lenin as the leader. However, eventually, Lenin's going to be exiled to Switzerland, and this is mainly because Tsar Nicholas II doesn't want Lenin spreading his Marxist ideas throughout Russia. So what are his ideas that the Tsar sees as so dangerous? Well, he is a pretty committed Marxist. His ideas are that socialism must be accomplished through a violent revolution, right? So there's no kind of gradual path from capitalism to socialism. So that means, if you remember from chapter 15, we talked about revisionism, right? These socialists who come along and say, you don't have to be as extreme as Marx, you can gradually incorporate socialist policies. Well, no, he completely denounces revisionism, all right? He also thinks that socialist revolution can be possible anywhere, including Russia, which was still relatively backward. And he also, this was one point where he differed from Marx. He did believe that the Workers' Party needed to be disciplined. It needed to be controlled by an intellectual who fundamentally understood the principles of Marxism and how to establish a socialist government. So, he realizes that maybe the just general workers may not be equipped to serve as the leaders of a socialist government. The Social Democrats are going to split into two groups. The Mensheviks, which means minority, and their ideas differ from Lenin's in that they still feel they're sort of revisionist, right? They feel like socialism it is going to be accomplished through an evolution, right? So, capitalism is a step in the process towards socialism. They want their party to be more democratic, and they want mass membership. All right, so basically they feel like because Russia's kind of behind economically compared to other countries in the West, that its process is going to have to go through a capitalist stage before they can get to socialism. And then you have the Bolsheviks, which means majority, which are much more loyal to Lenin's ideas. All right, so the road to the Russian Revolution. All right, so let's go back to the Bloody Sunday revolt in 1905. What you're going to see is that the Bolsheviks, because they feel as though the 1905 revolution did not do enough, are going to start to get behind plotting an additional revolution. All right, so first you're going to see that they're going to organize their own councils of workers, socialists, and intellectuals, and these are called the Workers' Soviet. All right, Lenin and also Leon Trotsky are going to be responsible for the formation of these Soviets. All right, and what you're going to see is, as World War I approaches, socialists are going to have increased influence in Russia. All right. So the first instance of revolution is going to be in February of 1917, and this is when the Tsar is actually overthrown. All right. So why was Tsar Nicholas taken off of the crown, or taken off of the throne? Some of it was a result of the Russo-Japanese War. If you remember, the Russians were defeated by the Japanese, and so this is going to really damage Russia's credibility. And it does lead to some of the reforms of 1905. However, the Bolsheviks are not satisfied with these reforms. Still, in general, the power of the Duma rested in the middle classes and the bourgeoisie. And so the working classes, the socialists, feel like this revolution needs to go farther. But arguably, the most important cause of the February Revolution was how poorly Russia was doing in the First World War. We talked earlier about how 1915 was that year where 2.5 million Russians died just in that year alone. All right, so there's a huge human toll. There's an economic toll on Russia, and they feel like there needs to be some sort of major revision of the government if they are literally sending people to battle with no guns. People are starving. Ultimately that shows some sort of incompetence in the government. All right. So with that said, the Tsar also, before he was overthrown, was seen as very incompetent. All right. The Duma, again, favored the wealthier classes. And the Tsar never really bonded with his citizens during the war, so he wasn't really seen as that supportive of the war effort, which was very bad because, of course, when the war began, we discussed how there was a lot of nationalism. Eventually, the Tsar does go to try to help the war effort, but that makes things even worse because in his place, his wife rules. Okay, Tsarina Alexandra, and she is influenced by Rasputin, who was seen as he's sort of like a mystical figure. He was credited by Alexandra for saving her son from dying of hemophilia. And so basically, with Rasputin's influence, Alexander tries to rule absolutely. She unseats a bunch of ministers. What you're going to see is that because Rasputin has a big hold on the royal family, a lot of government ministers in Russia are going to be really unhappy with Rasputin, which is eventually is going to lead to his assassination. But still, this whole sort of complication between the Tsar leaving for a while to go to the war, the Tsarina ruling in his place, and Rasputin's influence are going to make a lot of people kind of think, well, this guy is not really capable of ruling Russia. So these revolutions themselves, most of them take place in St. Petersburg, which during the war was renamed Petrograd to give it a less German-sounding name. What did the revolutions look like? They were mostly big strikes. They started in January and February of 1917, and the strikes were caused by lots of food shortages. Right, so most notably, you had women in Petrograd rioting for bread, and workers and soldiers supported them because they saw how people in Russia were starving as a result of these food shortages throughout the country. You had demonstrators demanding that the Tsar be overthrown, and they wanted a provisional government to replace him. You're also, interestingly, going to see that when the government orders soldiers to try to stop the revolutions, the soldiers are actually going to end up supporting the revolutionaries. Kind of similar to the 1830 revolts in France. Same thing happened. The National Guard just supported the revolutionaries. So because of all these riots, revolts, on March 2nd, Nicholas II abdicates, and the Duma declares what's called a provisional government on March 12th. All right, so how does this provisional government function? It's kind of a dual government. There are two different rivaling groups that are vying for power. The provisional government is one of them. All right. The leader of the provisional government is going to be Alexander Kerensky, who actually was technically a member of the Soviet, but he leads the provisional government instead. All right, so Kerensky, who is a leftist, who is a socialist, is going to actually be encouraging to a lot of leftists because they're going to see, to them, they see that they see the government as more legitimate because there are people to the left suddenly in power, right? Remember previously the Duma was really just working towards the wealthy. So, people saw that as a positive sign. The government was no longer just bourgeois. And also, one of the things that Kerensky was going for was coming out of the war by not losing land to the Central Powers. So Kerensky was generally supportive of the war effort. All right, he didn't want an outright revolution, however, which meant that he wasn't just going to let peasants take a whole bunch of land from the lords. All right, so he's a little bit more conservative or moderate in that way. One of the major things that Kerensky goes for is implementing more liberal reforms. Now, I didn't write these down, but they are written down in your notes, but they're very similar to the reforms that you see in other Western countries in the 19th century. So things like equality before the law, freedom of religion, speech, assembly, right to strike, amnesty of political prisoners, all right, electing local officials, 8-hour workday, all right, all very liberal reforms that we've already seen in other countries. Okay, so the opposing side, you're going to see the Petrograd Soviet, all right? So the Petrograd Soviet is going to be made up of workers and soldiers, people who directly overthrew the Tsar, all right? These soldiers are now controlling the army, all right? So they tend to be much more leftist. They tend to be made up of the poorer people. And at first, actually, they were okay with the provisional government being the authority figure because they saw this as, a stable force that would maintain control of the country. But as time goes on, they don't think that the provisional government is really issuing the kind of social reforms that the Petrograd Soviet wants. So as time goes on, they start to try to pressure the provisional government from introducing more extensive reforms. They want things to go even further to the left. Right, so eventually the Soviet is going to kind of bring together representatives from other Soviets, and it's going to emerge as this national body, the Petrograd Soviet. All right, and what they're going to do is demand these more radical reforms from the provisional government. And one of those reforms is called the Army Order Number 1, which is issued on the 1st of March in 1917. All right, there were still people who were loyal to the Tsar that were working in the Russian military, and so the Petrograd Soviet uses this army order to try to completely reorganize the military. All right, so the army order strips the former officers, the czars, of their authority, and instead puts power in the hands of common soldiers. Right, these elected committees of common soldiers. All right, so the idea was to make it a little bit more democratic and less loyal to the former czar, but at the same time, these people didn't have the same kind of training and background of those czarist officers. So what you're going to see is that the Army Order Number 1 is actually going to make the army discipline collapse. But and also, a lot of the soldiers that were given this new military authority were really scared of what the future might hold. They thought that they might be accused of treason against the Tsar for sort of taking power from these former military officials. And also, what this army order does is it makes it so that the Allies decide to support the provisional government instead of the Petrograd Soviet because they want the war to keep going on the Eastern Front, and it's only the provisional government that supports the war effort. Okay, you're also going to see anarchy results in various parts of Russia. All right, so by the summer of 1917, you're going to see a lot of nationalities and local governments try to take government into their own hands. So, they don't feel like the Petrograd Soviet is doing enough. We saw that because Kerensky was not willing to just take lands from lords and distribute it among the peasants. He saw that as too revolutionary. And so what peasants start to do in the summer of 1917 is they just seize land for themselves, right? So they're taking land from the lords, right? Sometimes it's very violent. It is actually quite similar to the Great Fear of 1789, which we studied in the French Revolution. And what you're going to see is that by 1920, you're going to have half as many landless peasants as you had prior to the war, or the revolution. All right, so the October Revolution is the actual overthrow of the provisional government, establishing a communist dictatorship in Russia. So actually, since we only have 1 minute left on this video, I'm going to save the final discussion of the Russian Revolution to a future video.